Okay, today's daf is Eruvin Daf Gimel. We're at the beginning still of the Masekhet. It's not too hard today, don't be nervous. So we are up to the last two words of Daf Bet Amud Bet. Basically what we had was a discussion about this limitation. We know that an alleyway that's walled on three sides, so in order to carry on Shabbat in this alleyway, it needs what's called a korah. It needs a horizontal beam going across the top, in which case there's a height limit. It has to be no more than 20 amot in height. And so Rav said that the reason why it can't be more than 20 amot in height is because just like the Hechal, just like in the Bet HaMikdash, the enclosed area called the Hechal, or called the Ohel Moed in the Torah, the Petach, the opening was 20 amot tall, and the width was 10 amot. It was a width of 10 amot. So too, a petach, an opening of an alleyway, has to have the same dimensions: 10 amot wide, 20 amot tall, and no more in height or width. Because if it's more in height or width, then in terms of width, it would be considered a breach instead of a doorway, and in terms of height, it would no longer be considered an entranceway. That's what Rav said. However, we're going to see some difficulties with this. Ela me'ata, if that's the case, and now we turn to Daf Gimel, lo tehane le'amaltera. The amaltera should not work. Tahahechal amaltera havyale, va'afilu achi esrim amahu de gavoa. That you see that the doorway of the hechal was 20 amot tall, and could only be 20 amot tall, and it had an amaltera. Amaltera is a decorative top. The decorative top above the hechal is called an amaltera, and still the doorway could only be 20 amot in height. So we see here too, with a mavoy, with an alleyway, we should assume that it can't be any more than 20 amot in height, even if it has an amaltera. And as we heard before, if it has some kind of a decorative beams going over the top, then even more than 20 amot would be okay. So why is that according to Rav? If we see from the Bet HaMikdash that despite having a decorative top, it still had a limit of 20 amot. So why does the Mishnah tell us that the mavoy, the alleyway, can have greater than 20 amot if it has a decorative top? So it's not, as we learned in the Mishnah, Chamesh amalterot shel milah hayu al gabav zol lemala mizo v'zol lemala mizo, that there were 5 decorative beams that went over the entrance to the hechal, one on top of the other, and yet still the hechal's door could only be 20 amot tall. So why do we make an exception with an alleyway and say that it can be taller than 20 amot if in fact, even in the Bet HaMikdash, it could only be 20 amot tall?
20 amot to the beginning of the decoration, or 20?
Oh, we're going to discuss that later. Don't worry about that yet. Okay, so now, what kind of an argument is this? Dilma ki tanyahi de amalteraot be'olam tanya. So the Gemara answers, perhaps the only place where they had the decorative top was the antechamber. Remember we said yesterday that the Beit HaMikdash had 2, the Mishkan didn't have this, but in the Beit HaMikdash there were 2 entranceways. There was what was called the Ulam, the antechamber, and then from the Ulam you went into a more narrow area, that was the Hechal, where you would find the Mizbeach, you would find the altar, the golden altar, the Menorah, the Shulchan, etc. So that decorative top that was being discussed in the Mishnah was a decorative top over the antechamber, but we already said we don't follow the antechamber. The antechamber was much wider and much taller than the Hechal. We're not using that as our model. We're using the Hechal as our model. V'hai mai kushya dilma tavnit Hechal ketavnit ulam. The tavnit, the shape of the hechal, was the same as the shape of the ulam. In other words, what the Gemara is saying is the reason why we're asking the question here is because just like there was a decorative top hovering over the doorway of the antechamber, there was the same exact kind of decorative top over the hechal entrance. And yet, what did we say? We said that Shlomo HaMelech, if he could have, he would have made the hechal entrance much wider and much taller. Obviously, he couldn't, even though it had a decorative top. It still wouldn't be considered an entranceway if it's too tall. So why is it that with a mavoy we say, with an alleyway we say, that even if it's taller than it's supposed to be, if it has a decorative top, we still recognize it as a doorway? This is a problem for Rav, who's telling us that there's a precise analogy here. So, okay, so Alama Amar Rabbi Ila'a, Amar Rav. Why is it that Rabbi Ila'a says that Rav says Rechavat Daled Afal Pi She'ena Bri'ah Ve'im Yesh La Amal Tera Afilu Gavoa Yoter Me'20 Ama Eno Tzarich Lema'et. Why is it that Rabbi Ila'a said in the name of Rav that if there's two cases in which we have two exceptions to the rule. Now we have the korah. Remember, you have an alleyway, and you want to allow people to carry in the alleyway. So what allows them to carry in the alleyway is this korah, this beam that goes across the doorway, the entrance of the alleyway. Why? Because the alleyway leads right into a public domain. You can't carry from a private to a public domain on Shabbat. So you need something there to signify that the alleyway is distinct from the public domain, so people won't carry from the alleyway into the public domain. So this korah this beam going across has to be of a certain sturdiness. If it's too light, it wouldn't be good enough. It has to be sturdy enough to hold a brick. If I placed a brick on it, it wouldn't break. However, if it's 4 tefachim in its width, so then so it's 4 tefachim in its width. Even if it's very thin, it still counts. That has nothing to do with our discussion now. That's just a point that's being made. That even if it's not very sturdy, if it's 4 tefachim in width, the tefach is a hand's breadth. If it's 4 tefachim in width, it's still good. And if it's higher than 20 amot, it's still good. If yeshla amaltera, if it has decorative engravings or something like that on the beam that goes across, then even if it's higher than 20 amot, it's still good. And Rav says that. But Rav is the person who says that we follow the specifications of the Hechal and the Bet HaMikdash. The Hechal and the Bet HaMikdash was limited to only 20 amot in height, even though the top of it had decorative beams. So why was it limited in 20 amot if really the halacha is that it could be even higher than 20 amot if it has decorative beams going across the top? So why does Rav contradict himself here? And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef says Amaltera matnitahi, that really the thing about the Amaltera, this idea that there's an exemption, there's an exception in the case where the cross beam has decoration, that's from a Braita. That's not Rav speaking. That's a Braita. Matnitahi, man katanela, who is the person who taught it? Amar Abaye v'hachama b'rei d'Rabba bar Avua katanele. So really, this is, in other words, the first question the Gemara asks is Rav Yosef says, since it's a Braita, maybe Rav questions the authenticity of the Braita. Maybe he disagrees with it. But Abaye says that Hamad, the son of Rabba bar Avua, was the one who taught it. V'teve amaltera matnita v'tikshel Rav. So really, this whole idea that if you have engravings in the crossbeam, it can be as high as you want. That should be a problem for Rav. Because Rav says we have to follow exactly what there was in the Hechal and the Bet HaMikdash. The Hechal and the Bet HaMikdash was limited to 20 amot no matter what the crossbeam looked like. So that should be, the same rule should apply to the Mavoy, according to Rav. So Amar Lach Rav will say to you, Dal ana mehacha, exclude me from here. Why? Meaning, I don't want to get involved in this discussion because matniyata mi lo kashyan ahadadeh. Isn't there a contradiction between the two baraitot? It's not my problem. It's not a contradiction between me and the statement. It's a contradiction between the two statements. Why? Because one baraita said that that the limit on the height of the doorway is 20 amot, just like the hechal, meaning we follow the hechal. The other baraita says that if the cross beam is decorated, then it could be higher than 20 amot. Is that my problem? That's not my problem. Two different sources are contradicting each other. Why are you blaming me for that? So Ella ma'id lach lemeimah, rather what are you going to say tonight? It must be a machloket tanaim. It's an argument between the rabbis. The statement that said that 20 amot was the limit is following one position, the position that we follow the design of the Beit HaMikdash. Whatever the specifications were in the doorway of the Beit HaMikdash are the specifications that we're going to apply to these halachot of Eruvin, to these halachot of alleyways on Shabbat. And according to the other view, we don't follow the specifications of the Hechal. And if the crossbeam is decorative, unlike in the Hechal where that didn't matter, in the case of the alleyway, it is going to matter. So I say also it's a machloket tanaim, and I am following the strict opinion. My opinion is that it's 20 amot no matter what. Whether the crossbeam is decorated or it's not decorated, it doesn't matter. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, below Rav matniata ahadade lo kashyan. Forget what Rav said. Rav is wrong again. Forget Rav. There's no argument here. L'Rabbanan korat ta'amamai mishum hekera. Rav is assuming that we have a contradiction in Braitot. Why is Rav assuming we have a contradiction in Braitot in these early sources? Because he sees one source that says that the limit of the height of an entranceway to an alley is 20 amot, if you want to permit carrying to go on in the alleyway on Shabbat. And what does it say? Kipitcho shel hechal, like the door of the hechal. So he says, you see, we're following the hechal. Then he sees another braita that says that if the crossbeam is decorated, even if it's higher than 20 amot, you can still allow carrying in the alleyway on Shabbat. He says, well, that's not like the hechal in the Beit HaMikdash. Because the hechal in the Beit HaMikdash was limited to 20 amot. And you're saying more than 20 amot, so it's a contradiction. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says there's no contradiction at all. What's the reason why a crossbeam works in general? Why does the crossbeam work? It works because it's hekera. Because a person will be walking in the alleyway and when they see the crossbeam over the top, they'll say, oh, I have to stop here, I can't carry past the crossbeam, right? That's why it can't be higher than 20 amot, because a person's not going to notice it if it's more than 20 amot. They're not going to see it, they're going to walk right past it. That's the reason. Simana be'alma, when he mentions the pitcho shel hechal, when it mentions the door of the hechal, the door, the entranceway to the sanctuary in the Beit HaMikdash, he's not saying that we derive 20 amot from the sanctuary doors, and therefore, whatever the specifications are of the sanctuary doors, we also have to apply to alleyways on Shabbat. No, it's just giving you simana be'alma. That's a siman. It's a way to remember the number 20 amot. Because back then people knew the Tanakh cold. They knew it right off the top of their head. You told them what's the height of the hechal, they're going to know 20 amot right away. So so that's a good way to remember it. But we're not saying that every specification with regard to the entrance of the sanctuary is going to apply to a mavoy. It's going to apply to an alleyway. We're not going that far. So therefore what? So therefore he says there's no contradiction. That yes, 20 amot is the basic measurement in height, but if there's a decorative crossbeam, it could be even higher. No contradiction there.
It all depends what's best that people recognize.
Right, what people recognize.
Like the Chanukah.
Right, exactly, right. And so here, people will recognize it because it has decoration, so people are going to look, oh yeah, look at the nice decoration on the crossbeam, even if it's 30 amot, it's okay, it's going to be okay. So for Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, now this is okay if he doesn't hold like Rabbah, but if he maintains, if he agrees with Rabbah, he's going to have a problem. What is Rabbah? What is that talking about? Tamar Rabbah, because Rabbah says in Masekhet Sukkah, Ketiv leman yedu dorotechem ki basukot oshavti ad 20 mama adam yodeh shedar basukah lemala me-20 mama en adam yodeh mishum de la shalta be'ena. This is the first sugya in Masekhet Sukkah. The first sugya in Masekhet Sukkah talks about the height of a sukkah and says you can't make your sukkah higher than 20 amot. 20 amot is approximately 30 feet. You can't make it higher than that. And Rabbah said, what's the reason? Because it says in the Torah, so that you should know that your forefathers were settled in Sukkot, that Hashem placed your forefathers in Sukkot, caused them to dwell in Sukkot. So what does Rabbah say? He says that up to 20 amot, a person realizes they're sitting in the Sukkah because they can see the roof, even when they're sitting down, they can see it. Higher than 20 amot, it's too high. So what is Rabbah saying the reason for the measurement of 20 amot is? Hekera, that you're going to see it. Same thing as here in the alleyway. What is he saying? The reason is so you can see it, right? So wait a second. But alma gabe sukkah nami behekera paligi, that it seems like over there with respect to sukkah, what is the issue there? Also, how high is too high to be able to see the sechach when you're sitting? And in that Mishnah, just like in our Mishnah, there's a machloket. That the Chachamim say the limit is 20 amot. Rabbi Yehuda says, as high as you want. Right? Say machloket. So if that's true, ipluge b'tzarte lamali. So why then do you have two arguments? According to Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, the whole reason for why you have a limit on the height of a crossbeam in an alleyway is because that's as high as you're going to be able to see. The passers-by are going to be able to see. And when it comes to a sukkah, what's the reason why you have a limit on 20 amot? Because that's how high people who are sitting in the sukkah are going to see. So it's the same argument, basically, between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Same argument twice. Huh? He said that there's no limit in both cases. So the question is, why does Rabbi Yehuda have to chime in both times? It's the same argument. So tzricha, the reason is you need it anyway. Because if we only had the case of sukkah, very simply, if we only had the case of sukkah, you could argue as follows. Rabbi Yehuda, why is he lenient in the case of sukkah? Because you're sitting in the sukkah. So maybe at first you're not going to notice, but eventually you're going to look up, you're going to see it. Even if it's very high. But a mavoy, an alleyway, we have to catch you in that split second that you're passing through. So you realize there's an end to the alleyway. So there, maybe Rabbi Yehuda will say there's a chance you're not going to look up. So that's why he has to mention it over here. It makes sense.
Unless there's that decoration.
Right, of course, that's the other case, right. And if we're talking in this case, only in the case of Mavoi, and similarly we could say that even though the rabbis are strict in the case of the Mavoi, and they say that in general a crossbeam has to be no higher than 20 amot, maybe in a sukkah they would agree that it could be higher. Why? Because there you're going to sit in the sukkah. So eventually you're going to look up. Sooner or later you're going to look up. You're going to realize you're sitting in the sukkah. So the point is that that's not a refutation. The fact that there are two parallel arguments between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim is not a refutation of Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak's interpretation here. He could say that the same principle is at stake in both cases. It's not redundant that they argue in both cases, because one case wouldn't be sufficient. Because you could argue that sukkah, you're more likely to look up. You could argue that in an alleyway, you're less likely to look up. So you have to have both sides emphasize that they stick with their positions in both cases that are involved. So my Amaltara, we go back to this issue of Amaltara. You said in Amaltara, whatever this is, some special kind of crossbeam is exempt from the rule, and it could be even higher than 20 amot. So what's the Amaltara? Rav Chama Bered Rabba Baravua, Rav Chama, the son of Rabba Baravua, said, Amar Keni, it's talking about some kind of bird's nests. In other words, it doesn't mean an actual bird's nest. It means some kind of decoration that would look like bird's nests or something creative, something different, something artistic, sticking out of the crossbeam. So people would look up because they would want to see this, even though it's higher than 20 amot.
That's a mantra.
Amaltara, that's the thing, yeah.
It's not a kishut?
It's some kind of, decoration. Yeah, but it looks like bird's nests, whatever. It's bumpy, it juts out from the beam in some way. Yeah, so Akiyata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came Amrei b'Ma'arava, he said that they said over in the West, they said in Israel, Masekhet Eruvin Daf, that all it means is extra long beams of cedar. They were stuck into the wall. Okay? So in other words, he's saying that just because they're very long, that's enough. They're very, very long beams, so they're so big, people are going to look. So the machloket is, does it have to be decoration, like some qualitatively different thing? Or is it just size alone, that it's very long and it's very large, that is enough to be noticeable?
But from the discussion, we can see that it has to be something that is noticeable.
Right. The question is largeness, is size alone enough? Right. Right. So Manda Amar Paskei Da'arza Kol Sheken Keni. That's why somebody who the position that said that large beams are themselves enough to be noticeable Kol Sheken Keni. So certainly, if they have a decoration, it's going to be noticeable. But Manda Amar Keni Aval Paskei Da'arza Lo, the one that said that it has to be some kind of qualitative decoration, some kind of design, is not going to agree that length alone is going to be enough.
Why would there be an argument? I don't understand the argument. If you're trying to prevent people from doing another law that is taken from a public domain to a private or otherwise,
right?
Then why don't you go with the stricter, the more the one that makes sense? That the kishud would be more
right, for sure.
So why not?
Well, because whenever they have an argument here, it's more of a theoretical argument, hypothetical argument, and also because sometimes you'll be in a situation, let's say, where you don't have that available. So they want to know, can we use just really large beams and people will notice them because they're so large? So, a lot of times we need to know the absolute limits of the law on both sides. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to push the limits, but for situations in which, you don't have a choice. It's like, you only need 2.5 walls for a sukkah. Does that mean I should only have 2.5 walls for a sukkah? No, but in a case where I don't have a choice, it works, So it's good to know that the minimum limits on both sides. What's the reason why large cedar beams should work? Mishum de nafesh mashche. right? It's because they're very long. So then the Gemara asks, but how come the fact that in a sukkah, sechach is very long? So even if it's over 20 amot, it should be good, because the sechach runs along the length of the whole sukkah.
What do you mean long? It's like bamboo?
Yeah, because it goes. I'm going to look up. It's long. I'm going to notice it. So why don't the rabbis allow it to be higher than 20 amot then? So the answer is because it's not just the size. Because it's so long, people notice it. People talk about it. Everybody says, "Hey, look at the huge beams up there." In other words, they stand out. Sechach is just a normal thing.
Unusual.
But something unusual that people are going to talk about. Hey, there are these really large beams. It's like, what makes the Washington Monument special? It's just a big thing. It's just big.
So how long is long?
But how long is it?
Long where it becomes unusual for a beam.
Right, it would be a good question. I mean, it doesn't give us an actual definitive number. Yeah. In the end, the halacha brought in the Shulchan Aruch is that we say it has to be qualitative. We say that it has to be a decoration. So if the Korah has some kind of decoration, artistic decoration, that's the one that we go with anyway. We don't use length or size as a deterrent or as a means of bringing people's attention, because we were concerned that it won't work. What if what you had was you put a crossbeam, you have the alleyway, and what ends up happening is the korah itself, the beam, is not totally within 20 amot. When we say that the beam has to be within 20 amot, what do we mean? Do we mean it can't be above 20 amot, or do we mean that even if part of it is within 20 amot, it's good enough of the ground? In other words, what if the bottom half of it is within 20 amot, but the top half is over 20 amot? So how do we know? Does the whole thing have to be within 20? That's the question. So similarly, same question with regard to sechach in the sukkah. What if you put it at exactly around the 20 amot line, so that part of it is hanging down within 20 amot and part of it is above? If you were to make an imaginary line slicing through it, half of it would be below the 20 amah line, and half of it would be above, let's say. So what's the halacha in that case? Amar Rabba says, "B'mavoi kasher b'sukkah pasul." Rabba says, in a mavoi it's okay, in a sukkah it's not good. Okay, let's see why. So why is it that it's kasher, damrin and kalosh? Is the reason why you're going to say that it's kasher in the case of a mavoy, in the case of an alleyway, is because we say slice off the top of the korah, pretend it's not there, and the bottom of it is all that's there, and it's still good enough. Sukkah nami lema kalosh. Why can't you say the same thing by a sukkah? It's the same principle. Just pretend that whatever's above 20 amot is not there. The problem is that in a sukkah, if I cut off the top half, it's not going to be enough sechach. It's not going to be enough. There's going to be too much light, not enough shade, if I cut off everything on top of the 20 amah line. But similarly, if, let's say, only a little bit of this beam is hanging beneath 20 amot, and I make an imaginary line and I cut off the top, so maybe what's left is going to be too thin. It's going to be so thin that it could be blown away in a regular wind. So that's not good either. Rather, we have to assume that it's like shipudin. It's considered like metal bars. In other words, shel matechet. We don't look at its physical properties. We don't say that if we made an imaginary line and we cut through this beam, that all we have is a very thin amount. We look at it as like as if it were steel. Similarly, with the sechach, we don't assume if we make an imaginary line that we're removing the rest of it and we're considering it too thin to serve as sechach. So why then are we making a distinction? If we have to be even-handed. In other words, we can't have a double standard. If making a line between the two, an imaginary line, leaves them both with the same qualities that they had otherwise. In other words, that in the case of sechach, it still has the same quality of providing shade. And in the case of the beam, it still has the same quality of heaviness. So fine. But if you're going to take away its other qualities when you make the imaginary line at the 20 amah line, so then you have to take away the qualities of both. And they should both not be good.
What those qualities? I mean, what's
the quality in the case of the beam is heaviness.
No, that wasn't the quality of the beam initially. The quality of the beam was its noticeability.
Right, but it also another requirement is it has to be heavy enough that it wouldn't be blown away. Right.
That. Really, the main purpose is to make it
true.
That's the main argument.
That's true. Right.
So then, why would that's a major quality there? So if you keep that all the same in the decorative thing, whatever its notability, then there wouldn't be a problem.
Right. True.
But otherwise, it would.
Right, so we're just dealing with a case where there's no decoration. It's just a regular beam.
In fact, if it's too thin,
and it's hanging below.
I mean, forget the. I don't.
People will or won't.
The argument is lost in my mind.
Where if they're
because if it's too thin, it's noticeability that people will be able to know it.
Right.
And duan avara is the main issue.
Right.
Whether it's heaviness or whatever.
Right. Well, they wanted to make sure it was stable.
Theoretically, I can bring you something that's very strong but very thin.
People won't notice it. Right. That's true. Right, so I think that's the point. That's part of the point here. If it's very light and very flimsy, the concern is, first of all, it could get blown away, but it's not really something of significance. So if when we imagine that if we have this item that's hanging half of it, 3/4 of it over the 20 amma line and a little bit below, if we make an imaginary line and we slice through it, whether it be sechach or it be the crossbeam, so whatever is left, are we in this imaginary thought experiment, okay? Are we still giving it all the qualities that it has in real life? Or are we treating it as if it lost those qualities? So if we're going to treat it as if it lost those qualities, then we have to apply the same to sechach and the same to the crossbeam. If we're treating it like it keeps the qualities, then we have to apply the same. So in other words, there's no basis here for a double standard. We have to apply the same to sukkah and to the mavoi. So Amar Rava says, Mi Parzakia. Rava from Parzakia said, Sukkah de liyachidhi lo madkar. That he says that the difference is like this, that when it comes to the sukkah, the concern is a sukkah is something that is of a private nature. Okay, it's of a private nature. And it could happen from time to time that this beam, in other words, shifts in such a way that really it gets out of place, like Rashi says here, that she'im tirkava tachtona shel korah. Let's say that the bottom of it wastes away. You left it there, it's there for 10 years, right? The bottom rots out, and now actually the whole beam is above 20 amot. Or the sechach starts to, come off, and in the end the entirety is above 20 amot. So Ravav mi Parzakia is saying that when it comes to a sukkah, okay, it's only your personal sukkah. You might not pay such close attention. You're the only one paying attention. And it might be that you end up with the entirety of your sechach above 20 amot because you're not paying attention, because the bottom wasted away. With the korah, the public is using it, so they're going to notice, this needs to be replaced. It wasted away. So that's the reason that he gives. Ravina says, Sukkah deoraita achmiru be'rabanan, that the sukkah is a deoraita. It's a biblical commandment. The rabbis were stringent and said it has to totally be within 20 amot. Mavoi de Rabbanan v'achmiru be'Rabbanan. The mavoi, even though it's a safeguard so that you don't carry things from the private to the public domain, the fact is that the idea that you can't carry in the alleyway without a special safeguard is rabbinic. So the rabbis can be lenient with their own rules. The rabbi said as long as the bottom of the beam is within 20 amot, it doesn't matter that the top of the beam is over 20 amot. But the sukkah, it's a biblical commandment. So they're stringent, and they say that you cannot rely on part of it being within 20 amot. The whole thing has to be within 20 amot.
What is rabbinic?
Sukkah is biblical.
No, right, but what is?
Because really, in the alleyway, you can carry. In an alleyway that's closed on 3 sides, you can carry. The rabbis just didn't want you to carry from the alleyway into the public domain. They wanted a reminder.
No, but if you did that would not be rabbinic. That would
be deoraita, for sure. You can never go past the line.
Right.
But the thing is, can you carry in that alleyway? So that's rabbinic, that you can't carry in the alleyway without putting the crossbeam. So you have to have the crossbeam to allow you to carry in the alleyway. All right, so that's rabbinic. So they were able to be lenient. There's a reverse version of this conversation. Okay, the reverse conversation reported by Rav Adabar Matana, that Amar Rabba said, "B'mavoi pasul b'sukkah kshera." Exactly the opposite. That in the mavoi, when we're dealing with the crossbeam in the alleyway, there, unless the entirety is within 20 amot, it's no good. In the sukkah, it's okay. That's the reverse. So first they go through the whole thing we said before. Is the reason you make a distinction here because you're making an imaginary line and slicing through them? Okay. So it's the same issue. If you're going to tell me that the problem is that you're making a slice through the crossbeam and only the part that's under 20 amot is counting, and therefore it's too light, it's too thin, So I'll say the same thing about the sechach. It's too light, it's too thin if you make a line through it. Rather, we have to maintain the same qualities it had before. And we have to treat the bottom of the crossbeam like it's made of metal. Very interesting. So what he says is the exact opposite argument. That the sukkah, because it's your own personal sukkah, you're going to take responsibility for it. Because who else is checking your sukkah? Nobody else is going to check your sukkah. You're going to be vigilant to make sure that it doesn't waste away. And that the part that's under 20 amot stays. But the Korah, it's the opposite. Since it's for the public, who takes responsibility? You see it, you say, not my problem. Oh, it's your problem. No, it's not my problem, it's his problem. That's why it says, Kedera de be shutafeh means, Kedera shel shutafim. Right? A pot of partners is never hot and never cold. What does it mean? Everyone thinks, it's group responsibility. When the group is responsible, nobody takes responsibility. We know that's a problem, an organizational problem, right? When you have a board, nobody thinks that it's their responsibility. When you task somebody, okay, this is your job, you're doing this, okay, I can do it. But you tell the group, collective responsibility, you tell everybody, please come for the minyan, nobody comes. You tell the person, I need you to come for the minyan, they come. Okay, individual responsibility works. So that's what he says. So the public is more problematic. It might waste away, and someone says to you, hey, Moshe, the bottom of it's not my problem. It's someone else's problem. So therefore, nobody ever takes care of it. That's the issue. Okay, so now, Ravina Amar Sukkah Deoraita Lo Ba'e Chizuk Mavoid Rabbanan Ba'e Chizuk. Both answers given were reversed. So first, in the first version, the fact that it was your private sukkah was worse. Public was better. There were more eyes looking at it. In the second version, the fact that the sukkah was private was better. Personal responsibility. It wasn't about how many eyes are seeing it. It was about responsibility. Collective responsibility isn't as good. But the second answer also, what was the distinction Ravina gave was Deoraita and Derabanan. He said, sukkah's Deoraita, therefore you have to be more strict. Mavoy, the idea of carrying the alleyway is only rabbinic. So here he says the same distinction, but the implication is reversed. Sukkah is deoraita, therefore, it doesn't require strengthening. Lo ba'echizuk.
What doesn't require?
In other words, the sukkah is deoraita.
Right.
So we know that it's a very serious mitzvah.
Right.
So we don't need to be so strict because you'll naturally be more cautious. Naturally, you don't need to have extra stringency. Mavoy, people will naturally take it lightly. It's only rabbinic. So therefore they said it must all be within 20 amot to show you how important it is, because the rabbis, to back up their own words, they have to be extra strict. Okay, so that's the way that they conclude this discussion. But now, what was the final conclusion? And interestingly, nobody knows at first. Rabba bar Rav Ula Amar. Rabba, the son of Rav Ula, says, Zev v'zeh pasul. That's no good in both cases.
On which case?
We're talking about the two cases of where the crossbeam hanging, but where most of it is over 20 amot and hanging, just the bottom hangs down to within, and the same with the schach. He says both of them no good. It has to be totally within 20 amot. Rava Amar, and this is the halacha. Zev v'zeh kasher. Both cases are good. So all the previous discussion becomes unnecessary. Okay, halal sukkatnan. Because what's the rule? The rule is halal sukkah. In other words, when we talk about it being 20 amot, we mean the airspace cannot be more than 20 amot. So even if the sechach is at the 20 amal line, it's good. Meaning the airspace within the sukkah has to be 20 amot, cannot be more than 20 amot. The airspace within the mavoy can't be more than 20 amot, which means even if the airspace is 20 full amot and the korah is right at the 20 amal line, that's fine. Even if the airspace of the sukkah is 20 amot and the sechach is right at the 20 amal line, that's also fine. Tanan, we learned halal mavoy, halal sukkah tanan. What we're learning about is the space within the sukkah. Halal mavoy tanan, and we're talking about the airspace within the alleyway. Amar le Rav Papa said to Rav Tanya de Misayalach. He says that there is actually a baraita that supports you. Mavoy shehu gavoa me'esrim ama yoter mibitcho shalech al yimaet, because it said that if the alleyway is taller than 20 amot, you have to lower it. Tehechal gufo chalalo esrim. And we're comparing it to what? to the Heichal. The Heichal door, it wasn't that the crossbeam was within the 20 amot. The entranceway was 20 amot. The crossbeam was above 20 amot. So we're talking about the airspace in the entryway that has to be less than 20 amot, or within 20 amot, to be good. Rav Shimi bar Rav Ashe objected to Rav Papa that we learned that how do you make the korah? How do you fix this alleyway? You place the korah from the edge of 20 amot and lower. Ema ulemala. We have to correct that. The text must be wrong. It means it has to be above 20 amot, the 20 amot line. In other words, it says in that statement that it sounds like it's saying that the beam has to be within the 20 amot. So he says no, lemala. It can be right above the edge.
The line of so where the airspace is 20 amot.
Right, is 20 amot. That's right. Right. So then it says v'ha lemata katane, but doesn't it say there lemata that it has to be less than 20 amot high, meaning the beam itself has to be less than 20 amot. So it says hakamash malan de lemata kilmala ma lemala chalala esrim af lemata chalala esrim asara. So what it's trying to teach you is that just like when we have a maximum, like the maximum amount is 20 amot, like in a sukkah, and the minimum height is 10 tefachim. 10 tefachim, 10 hand breadths in a sukkah. So just like we say with regard to the maximum, that it means the airspace, when we speak about the minimum, we mean the airspace. So don't think to yourself, oh, I can make a sukkah that the sechach is taking up, is at 8 tefachim or 9 tefachim. I'll just have 9 tefachim of airspace, and the 10th tefach will be the sechach. It's no good. It has to be 10 tefachim of space with the sechach on top of it, and it can go up to 20 amot of space. Not that the sechach has to be within 20 amot, but it has to be at the 20 amot line, so that there's no more than 20 amot of space in the sukkah, airspace. So Amar Abaye says, what? No more than 20 amot, no less than 10 tefachim. Right. So Amar Abaye Mishmei Rav Nachman. Abaye said the name of Rav Nachman. He said, Amat sukkah v'amat mavoi. When we talk about amot, with regard to the sukkah or with regard to the alleyway, be'amah bat chamisha, we're talking about an amah of 5 tefachim. There were 2 types of amah. Sometimes they measured an amah as 5 hands breadths, and sometimes they measured it as 6. So he says, when we talk about a mavoi, or we talk about sukkah, we use the number 5. But amat kilayim be'ama bat shisha. But when we deal with kilayim, when we deal with mixed, diverse seeds in a vineyard, as we're going to see, sometimes you have to space out when you want to plant. Let's say in a vineyard, you want to plant other produce. You have to space things out a certain way. So when we deal with the spacing, we use the amah of 6 tefachim, apparently because we're being more strict. So we want to have bigger space between them. So the Gemara asks, Amat mavoi ba'amat mavoi ba'ama bat chamisha l'mayil chita. So when we talked about the using the 5 tefach amah for a mavoi, what are we talking about here? Legova. Legovho, we're talking about the height. So when we measure the height of 20 amot, we measure it with the 5 tefach amah. Or lepirtzat mavoi, and we talk about it, and also with regard to a breach in the mavoi, we use the 5 amah measurement, the 5 tefach amah, which is an amah which is slightly smaller. So we're being actually more strict because we're gonna make the cutoff lower.
So the airspace,
right? The airspace, right?
The bare maximum that you can have without going.
Exactly. So let's say in the case of, so here if we wanted to translate the measurement, so we would say, oh, it's a 20 amah limit. That means it can't be more than 100 tefachim. Right? We wouldn't if we use the 6 tefach measurement, it would be 120 tefachim. Right? Which would be lenient. The airspace would be more lenient. So now the Gemara says v'ha'ika, whereas when it comes to kilayim, we're saying that if something has to be a certain amount of tefachim, a certain amount of amot away, we're making it a larger amah. Right. Here we're being more strict, right? So v'ha'ika meshech mavoi be'arba amot dilekula. But there is one case where this will lead to a leniency. What's that case? The length of an alleyway in order to be permitted to carry in the alleyway, let's say you have an alleyway that leads into the public domain, you want to permit carrying in the alleyway by putting a crossbeam, it has to be a minimum length of 4 amot. So why don't we use the strict amma and say that it needs to be a 6 tefach amma? Namely, 24 tefachim long. Because the way you're going now, it's only going to be 20 tefachim long. You're going to be lenient. So he says, that's because Keman Damar ba'arba'at tefachim. Because according to Rav Nachman is holding like the lenient opinion that says that even if the alleyway is only 4 tefachim long, it still can be permitted with a crossbeam. In other words, the minimum amount is very small for length.
Right, but that doesn't...
For an alleyway.
That doesn't address the crossbeam.
No.
If it's 4, the crossbeam has to be significant according to...
Right, of course. That's a separate issue. The question just is, let's say there was a tiny little alleyway that didn't have any length, so that wouldn't even have... you wouldn't be allowed to carry in there at all, because it's so small, the concern is you're going to carry right from there into the public domain. But Rav Nachman is holding the lenient view that even such a small alleyway, you could permit carrying there with a crossbeam. So that's why he's not concerned about what size amma you use to measure that length. Alternatively, barba amot, really he does hold that it has to be 4 amot. Virov amot ka'amar. But when he said that we use the 5 tefach amma to measure things in a mavoi, he meant in most cases, whenever it's a stringency. But when it's a leniency, we use the 6 amma one, the 6 tefach one.
With the leniency.
Right. The length will use the larger amma because there smaller is more lenient, right? The height we're going to use the smaller amma because there using the smaller amma is more stringent, right? So we're always going to go with the stringent measurements. He's just telling you it depends. So amat sukkah ba'amat bat chamisha. So we said that when it comes to sukkah we also use the amma of 5 tefachim. So lemay hilchata, again, what is the implication here? Legova. Number 1 is height, and the second one is dofen akuma. There's a concept of dofen akuma, which means that if you have sechach pasul, let's say you have sechach, and on the end of the sechach is something pasul, like you put boards that hold down the sechach that are not good, that are not kasher.
This is...
Right, exactly, yeah. So like on the edge of the sechach, you put, let's say, something which is not kasher for sechach. We say up to 4 amot. On the edge of the sukkah, on the edge of the sechach, you can put up to 4 amot material that's not kasher. Why? Because we say it's like the wall bends in. The wall bends in. So that's only up to 4 amot. So what does he say? So there we use the 5 amma measurement, 5 tefach measurement rather. So that would mean the 4 amot is only 20 tefachim. We're not going to allow you 24 tefachim, only 20 tefachim. And with the height, we're only going to allow you 100 tefachim in height. We're not going to allow you 120. Again, what about the fact that the length of the sukkah has to be 4 amot? And you're going to use 5 tefachim as the measurement of amma. And what's that going to lead to? It only needs to be 20 tefachim. Whereas if you use the more stringent one, you would end up with a stringency. You would end up with 24 tefachim instead of just 20. So the Tani Rabbi Omer, as it says, Rabbi says, Omer ani kol sukkah she'en ba daled amot al daled amot pesula. That Rabbi said that it has to be 4 by 4 amot, the sukkah. And you're going to use a lenient version of the amma. You're going to end up with a smaller sukkah being kasher. So Kirabanan damre afilu ein amachazeket el rosh v'rubav shulchano. That we hold like the rabbis anyway, who say that as long as it can hold the majority of the person and his head and his shulchan and his table, that's good enough. Which is 7 by 7 tefachim. We usually say it doesn't even have to be an amma measurement. Alternatively, le'olam Rabbihi, even according to Rabbi, v'rov amot ka'amar, and it just means most cases. Yes.
Well, what does it mean that it doesn't have to be an amma measurement?
In other words, we're talking about tefachim in the length and width of a sukkah. Right. It's 7 tefachim by 7 tefachim. It doesn't have to be amot. So we don't measure it in terms of amot. So when Rav Nachman said we can use a 5 tefach measurement of amma for sukkah for all things that we use an amma measurement, but we use a tefach measurement for that. So similar to the alleyway, he said, okay, for certain things maybe he uses a tefach measurement, so he doesn't need to say what kind of amma we use. Or when he said we use a 5 tefach amma, he meant to say that for all cases where it's a stringency, we use that. But when it's a leniency, we use the 6 tefach amma and we would switch over. Now, Kilayim, so amat kilayim ba'ama bat shisha. So he said, Rav Nachman said, that when it comes to kilayim, when it comes to mixed seeds in a vineyard, we use the 6 tefach ama. So lamay hilcheta, what is the case here? Lakarachat kerem v'limchola kerem. There are 2 cases of spacing in vineyards, and in both of these cases, we have a machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. One is called karachat kerem. Karachat kerem is where there's a space in the middle of a field. So you have a vineyard. There's an open space in the middle of the field, okay, and then there's vineyard on the other side.
What's the purpose to avoid the kilayim?
Yeah, well, you can't have them in the same field. So the question is, if you have space in the middle, when is it considered to be just a space within a field, and when is it considered a field in its own right? If it's considered a field in its own right, you can plant whatever you want in there. Right, that's karachat. So even if you had grapes planted over here and grapes planted over here, but in the middle there's a huge space, it's a different field. We don't say it's just space within the field. So the question is, when do we draw the line and say that? And limchola kerem is talking about on the edge of the field. If there's a wall, and between the wall, there's space between the wall and where the vineyard starts. So if there's a certain minimum amount, we would still say that that's just the wall of the vineyard. But if there's a large amount of space between the wall and the vineyard, we could call that a field in its own right. We're going to see in a second how Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel deal with this. So, Ditnan is learned in the Mishnah, Karachat Kerem Beit Shammai Omrim Esrim V'Arba Amot Beit Hillel Omrim Sheish Esrei Amot, that if you have a space in the middle of the vineyard, between a vineyard on top, vineyard A and vineyard B, there's space in the middle. So according to Beit Shammai, you need 24 amot in there to make it a separate field. Why? Because he says when you come through vineyard A, the first 4 amot out of the vineyard don't count. And if you come out of vineyard B, the first 4 amot don't count because they're really they're the edge of that vineyard. So what do you have left in the middle now? You're going to have 16 amot in the middle. 16 amot, he says, is what you need to define a separate field. 16 amot. Beit Hillel says, no, the total could be 16 amot. 4 amot when you come out of number 1, 4 amot when you come out of number 2, and then 8 amot is enough. 8 amot is enough in the middle for it to be considered a separate field. That's what he says. Now, Chola Kerem, what's Chola Kerem? Beit Shammai Omrim Shesh Esrei Amot, Ubeit Hillel Omrim Shetem Esrei Amot. So again, what's at the edge of the wall? So Beit Shammai says there has to be 16 amot between the edge of the wall and the vineyard for that to be considered a space where you can plant other things. Why? Because the first 4 amot away from the wall are going to be considered like part of the wall. Okay, it's going to be there as part of the wall of the vineyard. In other words, you have a vineyard, so you can't mix them together. It has to be separate. So the first 4 amot next to the wall you're not going to use for planting, because planting right next to the wall is not good for the stability of the wall. So then you're going to need at least 12 amot, he says, in order to. Why? Because he already said you need 8 amot to define a field, right?
Yeah, but the first argument is fine.
Right.
For this argument defines the wall is defining one vineyard and another vineyard, right?
In this case, no, it's not. It's just a wall.
Oh, it's just a wall.
It's just a wall, yeah. So 4 amot away from the field, away from the wall, and then you have 12 amot in that space, right? 4 amot away from the vineyard, 4 amot away from the wall. Okay, since you're not in between two vineyards in that case. Wait a second, I'm mixing something up here. Right, he says that the reason that what you need is not 4 amot away from the wall. What is it? You need it to be only 2 amot away from the wall, right? Yeah.
Who says that?
Yeah, Beit Shammai. Okay, so we'll see it actually. Let's just see what he says. So Ezo hi karachat kerem. What is considered a spot in the middle of the kerem? Kerem shecharav emtzaito, and sham shesh esrei ama lo yavi zera lesham. Hayu sham shesh esrei ama noten lo kedei avodato v'zorea et hamotar. So he says that in the case of where you have a space in between, you need 16 amot in between the 2 vineyards, according to Beit Hillel. In order to plant in there, when it's in between the 2, and what is mechola kerem? What is the edge of the field? Or the edge of the vineyard? Ben kerem lagader and sham shetem esrei ama lo yavi zera lesham. Ayushta sham shetem esrei ama noten lo kedei avodato v'zorea et hashar. So the point is that what you have is away from the wall, you need 12 amot between the wall and the vineyard, and then you can be zorea. You're able to. Right, so it's 4. So it is 4. So according to Beit Hillel, according to Beit Shammai, what you have is 4 amot away from vineyard number 1, 4 amot away from the wall. So I was right the first time, and then 8 amot in the middle. According to Beit Hillel, 4 amot away from the wall, 4 amot away from the vineyard, and 4 amot in the middle is enough.
So, like always, you let us.
So when it's right, so when it's in between, right, so when it's in between 2 vineyards, both of them double the amount that you need, basically, right? Because Beit Hillel says you need 8 amot of working space, 4 amot and 4 amot on either side, and Beit Shammai says you need to have 18 amot of, or 16 amot rather, 16 amot, and 4 and 4 on either side, right?
One is 16 in the middle. That's
in the middle, and at the edge, one is going to say that you need 4 away from the wall, 4 away from the vineyard, and 8 in the middle. Okay, which is 16, and the other one is going to say that you need 4, 4, and 4, which is going to be 12. Right, so that's the way that it works out according to this. So when you're in between 2 vineyards, they're more strict than when you're away from the wall. Now, what's the point? So he's saying that in this case, what do we use for amot? We use the stricter amah of 6 tefachim per amah. So that means that when we talk about, let's say, 4 amot, instead of doing that as 20 tefachim, it's going to be 24 tefachim for the 4 amot. Now, but still, but there is a case where the 4 amot is a leniency, which is ritzufim. What is that going to be? Ditznan, as we learned in the Mishnah, kerem hanatua al pachot me'arba amot. Rabbi Shimon omer eno kerem, v'chachamim omrim kerem, v'ro'in et ha'emtzayim ki'ilo enam. So what the issue here is let's say that you've planted various vines, okay, and they're lined up, but there's not 4 amot in between each line. So the question is that really considered a kerem? Is that really considered a vineyard? In other words, what defines a vineyard? If I just plant a couple of strawberry bushes in my backyard, did I make a strawberry field? No. So if I just plant a couple of grape seeds in the back, I didn't make a vineyard. A vineyard means that things are lined up with a space between them in an orderly fashion. So Rabbi Shimon says that if you have things that are less than 4 amot together, you just have a mishkababel of different things that you planted, vines together. That's not a vineyard. Right next to that, I could plant whatever I want because that's not a vineyard. That's just random seeds that I planted. Unless there's 4 amot in between each line to define it as a vineyard. The rabbis say, no, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. They say it doesn't matter. Even if you don't have space between the two, we look at whatever's in between as being nothing. In other words, as long as you have a space, let's say you planted vines over here, and then 4 amot over there are more vines, it's still considered a vineyard, even though in between you also planted vines. So according to Rabbi Shimon, unless there's space in between the vines, it's not really a vineyard. According to the Chachamim, even if it's filled in the middle, it's considered to be a vineyard. So the point is that according to Rabbi Shimon, having a smaller or a larger amah here is going to be more lenient. Because even if you have, let's say we have 2 types of amah. We have the 20 tefachim of definition of 4 amot, and we have the 24 tefachim. Let's say I'm using the 20 tefachim, which would seem to be, or let's say I'm using a 24 tefachim, which would seem to be the more stringent measurement. But the thing is, let's say that these 2 vines are within 20 tefachim of each other.
Then it makes sense.
Right? He's going to say, oh, that's not a vineyard. I'm more lenient. It's not a vineyard. They're not 24 apart. It's not a vineyard. So actually you're being lenient. By using the larger measurement, you're going to be lenient. Because since they're only spaced 20 tefachim apart, you're going to say it's not a vineyard. So the answer is that, really, what do we say? That Kirabanan, Da'amre have kerem. That really we're going to, that the reason why is because we follow the rabbis who say it doesn't matter anyway. So in all respects, we're always going to use the larger measurement of an amah. Always. Because we don't hold like Rabbi Shimon, that if it's not spaced 4 amot.
What's the what's the all?
Because there are different cases where an amma is significant.
No, I realize that this whole thing was different.
Right.
It goes into the amma.
Right. So this case, Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Shimon, there's one situation where Rabbi Shimon will be more lenient if he uses a larger measure for amma.
Right.
But the thing is that position of Rabbi Shimon is not the halachically accepted position anyway. So it's not even relevant. So all halachic, according to the positions that we accept la halacha,
including for sukkah,
for everything. But now we're talking about kilayim. Now we're talking specifically about the mixed seeds. So in this area of mixed seeds, we're using the larger measurement of amma in all cases, because even in this case we hold like the chachamim anyway. For kilayim only. For kilayim only. Yeah, for kilayim only.
We're not talking about everything else.
No, everything else we were talking about the 5 tefach amma, right?
Where 5 is defined as
20
4
tefach.
is the more
exactly, where it's more strict. Here 6 is more strict. Exactly. So now ve'ibayit ema, and maybe le'olam Rabbi Shimon. Maybe really we do hold like Rabbi Shimon, but however, virov amot ka'amar. And when Rav Nachman, in other words, going back to Rav Nachman's original statement, Rav Nachman's original statement was that in 2 cases, in the case of Sukkah and Mavoi, we use the smaller amma. In the case of Kilayim, we use the larger amma. So we tried to work out, is it always a stringency to use the larger amma? And we found that yes, it's always a stringency in Kilayim to use the larger amma, except according to Rabbi Shimon, that it would actually be a leniency to use a larger measurement of amma, because you're going to allow the vineyard, you're going to allow lines of vines that are that are 20 tefachim apart to not be considered a vineyard. So the Gemara says there are 2 possibilities. Either, we don't hold like Rabbi Shimon anyway, so according to the Chachamim, in all cases of Kilayim, the larger amma is more stringent. Or even if we do hold like Rabbi Shimon, and even if we did say that in this case a larger amma would actually be a leniency, and we would use a smaller amma in this case, still Rav Nachman's statement that in Kilayim it's always better to use the larger amma, he meant most of the time. Fine, there's an exception to the rule, but he meant as a general rule of thumb, we're going to use the larger amma in that case, and that's where we'll conclude for today.